Della Hartwick counted her coins twice on the store counter. 11 cents short of the flour she'd already sacked back. She did not argue. She did not let her mouth tighten. She only set the flour down, quiet as a woman folding a letter, and turned for the door. And that would have been the end of it. Except the storekeeper's boy called after her. "Your account's already square, ma'am. Paid clean through spring." Same as always. 8 neighbors were warming their hands at the stove. Every one of them turned to look. 3 killing winters she had scraped through, certain she owed the world. And the world, it turns out, had been paying her. Someone had covered her feed and her flour every winter for 3 years. And asked the storekeeper to swear he'd never say who. Today the boy's tongue slipped. The name is coming. If you believe it's never too late for the heart, this story is for you. Before we go on, do one thing for me. Subscribe so this story finds the next person who needs it. And comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Della's story travels. Now, let me take you back to the beginning and tell it slow. The country north of Kettle Creek did not forgive much. The wind came down off the high sage in the fall, and it did not stop until April. It scoured the paint off a barn. It found every gap in a wall. It sang in the stovepipe at night like something that wanted in. Della Hartwick had lived in the teeth of that wind for 11 years. 3 of them alone. She was 47. She'd been a wife, and then she wasn't. The homestead was Tom's before it was hers, but she'd worked it long enough now that her hands knew it better than his ever had. A milk cow. A dozen hens, when the winter left her a dozen. A garden the frost kept stealing, row by row, so that she planted twice for every once she harvested. It was not much, but it was paid for in something harder than money, and it was hers. She rose before the light. She always had. Cold mornings she'd break the ice on the water bucket with the flat of the axe, and the sound of it cracking was the first sound of her day. She milked the cow with her forehead against its warm flank. She gathered what eggs the hens gave up. She fed the stove sparingly, because coal cost and wood was work. And a woman alone learned the price of everything. She did not feel sorry for herself. That was the thing about Della. She'd have thought self-pity was a kind of theft, taking sympathy she hadn't earned. She had earned her grief, though, that she'd paid for in full. Tom took a fever the 3rd winter after they'd proved up the claim. It came on him fast, the way those things did out there, past the reach of any doctor worth the name. She nursed him 9 days. She kept the water cool on his brow and warm in his cup. She talked to him when he couldn't talk back. And on the 9th night, the fever broke him instead of breaking, and she was a widow before the sun came up. She buried him herself. The ground was frozen, and it took her the better part of 2 days to open it, and no one came to help, because no one knew yet, and by the time the neighbors heard, it was done. She'd set the stone herself, too. A flat gray slab with his name cut shallow, because she was no stonecutter, and the chisel was Tom's and heavier than she'd guessed. She'd knelt at that grave and made a promise. She would not lose his land, and she would not lean on any man to keep it. She'd carry it alone, or she'd go under alone, and either way, she'd owe nobody. 11 years married, 3 years a widow, and a vow said out loud to a mound of turned earth, which is the kind of vow a person keeps hardest. That was who she was, the winter this story turns on. A stubborn, decent, upright woman. Proud in the way the poor sometimes have to be, because pride was the one thing the wind couldn't take. Understand her first. Love her first. Because everything that follows only means something if you do. Her nearest neighbor of any account was Amos Rourke. His spread sat 4 miles south and east, closer to the creek, better watered than hers. He ran cattle, or he had, back when the range still carried them. He was 58 and he wore it. Gray in the mustache and none left on top worth mentioning, a wide, weathered face that didn't give much away. A widower too, though older in it than she was, his wife gone a long dozen years. Della did not think much of Amos Rourke. Not ill, exactly, she just didn't think warm. He'd been Tom's partner once, on the long trail up from Texas before either of them settled. Tom had spoken of him fondly, called him the closest thing to a brother he had. But Tom was gone, and the man Della knew was not a brother to anybody. He was a man who tipped his hat and said 4 words and rode on. She'd meet him on the Kettle Creek road maybe once a month. "Morning, Miss Della." That was 2 of the 4. And then some remark about the weather, which was the other 2, and then he was past her, and gone, sitting his horse straight as a fence post, not looking back. She read that as coldness. As a man who'd cared for her husband and had no care left over for the widow. It stung a little, if she was honest, though she'd never have admitted the sting. She figured Tom's friendship had died with Tom, and that was the way of men. She was wrong about him. She was wrong about him in a way she could not have guessed, and would not guess for a long time yet. Because here's a thing Amos Rourke could not do. He could not talk. Not about anything that mattered. The words would come up his throat and stop there, every time, like water hitting a plug of ice. He'd loved his wife 20 years and told her so maybe twice. He'd stood at Tom's grave a week after the burial, alone, hat in his hands, and said nothing, because there was nothing his mouth could carry that was equal to it. What Amos had instead of words was his hands, and what his hands could do, they did in the dark, where no one would see and make him speak of it. The first snow came early that year. It came in the last week of October, a thin, dry snow that squeaked underfoot and glittered mean in the morning sun. Della opened her door to it and nearly stepped on the jar. It sat on her step, square in the middle, as if it had been set there with some care. A stone crock, actually, not a jar, though she'd always call it the honey jar after. And it was full of wild honey, dark as tobacco, thick and clouded and smelling of sage and summer. There was no note. She stood there a moment with the cold air pouring past her ankles into the house, and she looked up and down the empty white yard, and there was no track she could read, the snow having come and gone in the night and drifted over whatever had been. Some shy child, she decided. There were the Pruitt children over the rise, and the eldest boy was a strange, soft-hearted thing who wouldn't meet a grown person's eye. It would be like him, she thought, to leave a gift and run. She'd give the crock back full of eggs when she got the chance, and never embarrass him by asking. She took the honey in. She had it on her biscuit that morning, and it was the sweetest thing that had crossed her table in a year, and she thought no more about who. The honey jar. Remember it. It comes back. She had to go into Kettle Creek that week for flour. She dreaded it, not the ride. Though the ride was cold, she dreaded the counter. Because she was carrying credit at Pettigrew's store, and had been all fall, the way most of the drought-broke families in the valley were carrying credit, and a woman with pride hates nothing so much as an open account. Every sack of flour on the book was a small humiliation she meant to pay back and stand clean of. Silas Pettigrew kept the store, a narrow, nervous man, all elbows and spectacles, forever wiping his hands on his apron, whether they were dirty or not. He kept his ledgers in a fine hand, and he knew every soul's business in 40 miles, and mostly he kept it to himself, which is a rare and valuable thing in a small town. Della came in stamping the snow off and braced herself. She'd worked out her figures on the ride in. She owed more than she liked. She meant to ask him, humble as she could stand to be, to carry her a while longer. But when she laid it out, Silas got a queer look. He pushed his spectacles up. He wiped his hands. He looked down at his book, and then he looked at her, and he said, "Gentle as anything. You're lighter than you think, Miss Della. Don't trouble yourself on it. You're carried through fine." She frowned. "That can't be right. I had the seat on account, and the coffee, and it's right," he said. Quick, I keep the book careful. You're carried fine. And there was something in the way he said it. A kindness that didn't quite fit a storekeeper and a debt. But Della was tired, and cold, and mostly relieved, and relief will paper over a great many small strangenesses. She decided her own arithmetic had run ahead of her. She'd always been quicker with a needle than a sum. She took her flour and thanked him and rode home, and she thought Silas Pettigrew a kinder man than she'd credited. The account was lighter than her arithmetic. She blamed her own bad figuring. She had no way to know she'd just stood 2 feet from the whole secret and never smelled it. The cow calved in a storm in November. It was bad timing, as those things always are. The wind had swung to the north and thickened, and the snow came sideways, and Della was out in it past dark with a lantern that the wind kept trying to kill, because the cow was down in the lean-to, and the calf was coming wrong. She knew enough to know it was wrong. A foot back, or the head turned. She got her sleeve up and her arm in, and she could feel it. The hot dark tangle of it, but her hands weren't strong enough, or the calf was too big, and she knelt there in the filthy straw with her arm going numb and the cow groaning, and she felt, for one bad minute, the whole thing slipping away from her. The cow was half her living. She could not lose the cow. She did not hear the horse over the wind. She only knew a man was there when the lantern steadied. He'd come up on the leeward side and put his own broad body between the flame and the storm, and the light stopped guttering, and she looked up, and it was Amos Rourke. He didn't ask what was wrong. He could see what was wrong. He shucked his coat and rolled his sleeve without a word and knelt down in the muck beside her, and his arm was longer than hers and stronger, and he worked slow and patient, feeling for the trouble the way you'd feel for a knot in the dark. She held the lantern. She held her breath. "There," he said, one word. And she felt it too, the calf turning under his hand, the foot coming round. It came in a rush then, the way they do, and the calf slid steaming into the straw, and the cow heaved and lowed and turned to lick it, and it lived. It shook its wet ears, and it lived. Amos wiped his arm down with a twist of clean straw. He shrugged back into his coat, and Della, shaking with cold and the leftover fear, said the only thing there was to say. "Come in, warm up. Let me give you coffee at least." She thought he'd refuse. She half wanted him to, so she'd not have to owe him even a cup. He didn't refuse. He followed her in and stood by the stove dripping, and she poured him coffee, and he wrapped both hands around it and looked at nothing. She sat across from him. Neither one of them said a word. And here is the strange part. The silence was not uncomfortable. She'd have expected it to be. Two people who barely knew each other, in a small warm room with the storm outside. But there was something easy in it. He drank about half the cup, slow, and she watched the steam of it, and the fire ticked, and the wind hunted around the eaves and couldn't get in. It was, she realized later, the first time in 3 years she'd sat in a quiet that didn't ache. Then he set the cup down, still half full, and he stood. "Obliged," he said. And, "Keep the calf dry." And he was gone into the storm before the coffee had even cooled enough to drink. She sat there a while after. She told herself he'd only done what any neighbor would. But she found, cleaning up, that she'd left his half a cup of coffee sitting where it was, and hadn't wanted to pour it out just yet, and she couldn't have told you why. "Now, I have to take you somewhere Della couldn't go, because to understand her, you have to understand what she never saw. Follow Amos Rourke down into Kettle Creek that same week, after dark, after the store had turned its lamp down and hung its closed sign. He didn't go to the front. He went to the back, where Silas Pettigrew was still at his books, and he knocked the way a man knocks who's done it before. And Silas let him in, and didn't seem surprised, and poured him nothing, because this was business and both of them knew it. Amos put money on the table. It wasn't much money. It was, in fact, near everything soft he had. He counted it out in coins and worn bills, slow, and Silas watched him do it, and neither one of them enjoyed it. Della Hartwick's winter, Amos said. Feed and flour. Through spring. Same as before. Silas nodded and made his marks. 2 ledgers, he kept. One for the world to see, where Della's account showed light and easy, and paid. And one for the truth, where the same money showed leaving Amos Rourke's thin hand, winter after winter, going on 3 years now. You want to hear me say it, Silas said. I'll say it. She'd take a strip off you if she knew. She's not to know. Amos's voice was flat. You swore it before. Swear it again. I swore it. Swear it again. And Silas, patient, wiping his hands, swore it again. That not one living soul would hear from him whose money kept the widow's stove warm and her cow fed. 3 years running he'd sworn it, and 3 years running he'd kept it, and it was near to killing him, a man who lived on other people's news, to sit on the sweetest piece of it in the county. Amos put his hat on. At the door he stopped, the way men do when a thing wants saying and can't get said. Silas waited. But nothing came. Nothing ever came. Amos went out into the dark and got on his horse and rode the long cold 4 miles home. Now you know. You know before she does. Hold on to that. Because from here on, every time she thinks she's alone, you'll know she isn't. And it's going to cost you something to watch. There's a piece of it even Silas didn't fully see, and I'll give it to you now so you carry the weight of it too. Amos Rourke could not afford this. His ranch was not what it had been. The range had gone dry 2 summers running, and the cattle had thinned, and the ones he'd sold had gone cheap. He was a man living close to the bone, closer every year, and the money he laid on Silas's table each winter was money that should have gone to his own margin. He was choosing her flour over his own cushion. He was going without, so she wouldn't have to. And he'd have cut his own tongue out before he'd let her know it. That was Amos's whole trouble in one line. He believed love unspoken was love kept safe. He thought if he never said it, it couldn't be refused, and couldn't be spoiled, and couldn't shame her. He thought silence was the same as safety. It wasn't. It nearly cost them both everything, but that comes later. The trouble that would break the whole thing open rode into the valley about then, on a good horse, in a good coat, with a leather case of papers. His name was Harlan Voss. He was a landman. A speculator. He went around the drought-broke country buying up homesteads for cents on the dollar, or holding the paper on the ones that couldn't quite be bought, and waiting. He was patient the way a bank is patient. He did not raise his voice, and he did not need to. He'd sit his horse in a man's yard and look at the man's failing crop and do the arithmetic out loud, gentle, ruinous, and ride away. And everyone knew he'd be back. Voss held paper on half the valley. And what mattered most to this story, though nobody knew it yet, but Voss and one other man, was this. Harlan Voss held a note on Amos Rourke's ranch. $600. Callable in the spring. $600 Amos did not have, and had less of every winter, because a good part of what should have been building toward it was going on to Silas Pettigrew's quiet second ledger under the name Hartwick. Voss didn't know that part. Voss just knew the old rancher was slow with him, and that thin men fall. He treated ruin as arithmetic. He'd have told you, if you asked, that there was nothing personal in it. That was the worst thing about him. To Harlan Voss, a man's whole life was a column of figures, and figures don't beg. The note sat there, in Voss's leather case, ticking toward spring. Remember it too. It's the axe over everything soft in this story. There was a church social at Kettle Creek in December. They held it in the meeting house, the one building big enough, with the 2 stoves going, and the windows fogged, and the whole valley crowded in out of the cold. There was pie, and there was coffee, and there was up front the circuit preacher. His name was Elias Ives. Reverend Ives. He came through Kettle Creek every few weeks on his circuit, a widower himself, a mild and decent man with a good voice and kind eyes. And he had made no secret, that fall, that he'd taken a particular interest in the widow Hartwick. He courted her the way a good man courts. Openly, respectfully, he'd walk her to her wagon. He'd carry a word from her at meeting. And that night, before more of the town than Della would have chosen, he made his interest plain. He didn't propose, not in so many words. But he stood near her by the stove, with half the valley pretending not to listen, and he spoke of the parsonage in the county seat. Warm, he said. A good stove, and a full woodshed, and a roof that didn't leak. He spoke of a life where a woman wouldn't have to break ice off a bucket at dawn, where she wouldn't have to carry a homestead on her own 2 hands. He offered it kindly, and he meant it kindly, and it was, God knew, a warm and respectable and sensible future he was holding out to her. And the town watched her hesitate. She did hesitate. She'd be a liar to say she didn't. She was 47 and tired to the bone, and here was a good man offering her rest. Any sensible woman would have taken his hand right there and thanked the Lord for it. But something in her wouldn't. Her heart didn't move. It stayed where it was, stubborn, and she couldn't have told you why, only that a warm parsonage sounded to her like a lovely room she'd never quite be at home in. She said something soft. That she was honored. That she'd think on it. Which everyone understood to mean not yet, and maybe not ever, and the Reverend took it like a gentleman, and let it lie. Now, back against the far wall, by the door, where the cold came in every time it opened, stood Amos Rourke. He'd heard all of it. The parsonage. The warm future. The good man's open, honest offer. He stood there with his hat in his hands, and he watched the woman he'd kept alive for 3 winters, in secret consider marrying somebody else. And he said nothing. He didn't cross the room. He didn't so much as clear his throat. But a man near him said, after, that he'd never seen the color go out of a face like that, and the man still stay standing. Amos went gray as ash against that wall, and held his hat, and said not one word, and when the social broke up, he was the first one gone into the dark. Look at what that room held. The whole shape of the story was standing in it, if anyone had known how to read it. The man who would have given Della everything he had, and had, could not give her a single word. And the man who could give her 100 warm words couldn't stir her heart an inch. She was being offered safety by one and devotion by the other, and she could see only the safety, because the devotion had never once let itself be seen. She rode home from that social troubled, and didn't know why, and told herself it was the pie sitting heavy. It wasn't the pie. Deep winter came down after that, and it came down hard. There was a stretch in January that people talked about for years, a blizzard that shut the valley for 9 days. The snow came, and then it came again on top of itself, and the drifts stood higher than a man, and the wind never let up, so that going from the house to the barn was a thing you did on a rope, and half feared you wouldn't come back from. Della's hay ran short. She'd cut what she could in the fall, and it was never going to be enough. And she stretched it, and stretched it, cutting the cow's ration and then cutting it again, and the cow got gaunt and lowed at her with those wet, reproachful eyes. Her hens took a sickness, some winter croup that ran through the flock, and she lost 4 of them, and stood in the freezing coop with a dead hen in each hand, and did not cry, because crying froze on your face out there and taught you not to. She got through on credit. That was how she survived that stretch. She'd send in an order with anyone bound for town, and the flour and the little sack of feed would come back, and Silas would carry it on the book, and Della would lie awake nights, doing sums of what she owed, and swearing she'd pay it back come spring if she had to sell the shirt off her back. She thought she was surviving on faith and her own 2 hands. She thought the store was carrying her out of Christian patience. She banked every hard day as proof she could do it alone. And every one of those days, 4 miles south, Amos Rourke was selling off his own ground to keep her afloat. He sold a horse that January, a good saddle horse, a bay he'd raised from a colt and thought the world of, the kind of horse a man keeps when he's sold everything else. He sold it cheap because everything sold cheap that winter, and he took the money and he split it. Part went on to Silas's quiet ledger to keep Della's flour coming, and part went to Voss toward the interest on that $600 note to buy himself a little more time before the axe came down. He was trading his own ground for her warmth, piece by piece, a horse for her flour, his margin for her stove, and not a soul knew it, and he meant to keep it that way clear to the grave. You have to understand, watching this. He wasn't a fool. He knew what he was doing to himself. He just thought her getting through the winter was worth more than his getting through it. He'd made that sum in his own heart a long time ago, and he never once redid it. When the blizzard finally broke, Amos came by. He came in the thin, bright cold that follows a big storm, when the whole world is blinding white and the sky is hard blue, and it's so still after 9 days of wind that your ears ring with it. He rode up leading nothing, carrying only something across his saddle, and Della came out shading her eyes. It was her harness, her driving harness. The good set, that had cracked through at the trace back in the fall, and that she'd not had the money nor the leather to mend, so that she'd been making do with a patched single rig all winter. Found this on the road, Amos said. Figured it was yours. Now Della knew for a fact it had not been on any road. That harness had been hanging on a nail in her own barn since October, cracked and useless. She opened her mouth to say so. And then she took it in her hands, and she saw. It had been mended. Beautifully mended. The cracked trace had been cut back clean, and a new length of leather spliced and stitched in, stitched by lamplight by someone who'd taken real care, the stitches small and tight and even, the new leather rubbed with oil to match the old. It was hours of work. It was patient, loving, invisible work, done by a man in his own barn at night, and then carried over with a lie about the road, so no thanks could land on him. She looked up from the harness to say something. She didn't know what, and she caught him looking at her. He hadn't expected her to look up so quick. And for one unguarded second his face was open, and what was in it was not a neighbor's face at all. It was the way Tom used to look at her across the table in the early years, before the work wore the softness off both of them. That naked, private tenderness. On the weathered face of a man who tipped his hat and said 4 words and rode on. She startled. She actually stepped back half a step, the harness heavy in her arms, because she did not know what to do with what she'd just seen. And Amos shut it away like a man slamming a door. The face went blank and weathered again. He touched his hat. "Well," he said, "and drive careful." And he turned the horse and left, quick, before either of them had to say another word. Della stood in the blinding snow with the mended harness in her arms and her heart going strange in her chest. She told herself she'd imagined it, a trick of the hard bright light. But her arms remembered the weight of that careful work, and her eyes remembered that look, and 1 small centimeter of the ice she carried had gone, without her leave, to water. Winter ground on toward the anniversary. It fell in February, the day Tom died. 3 years now. Della kept it the way she kept it every year. She walked out to the grave on the low rise behind the house, where the wind had scoured the snow to a crust, and she cleared the stone off with her mitten, and she stood there in the cold and talked to him. She told him about the cow and the calf that had lived. She told him the hens had taken sick, but she'd pulled the flock through. She told him she'd kept the land. 3 winters, and she'd kept every acre of it, the way she'd sworn she would, and nobody could say the widow Hartwick had let his place go to ruin or leaned on any man to save it. She believed that when she said it. That was the ache of it. She stood there proud over having done it all alone, and she had never in her life been less alone. And she didn't know. Back in the house, she kept Tom's things the way a person keeps a shrine. His heavy coat still hung on the peg by the door where he'd left it, and she'd not moved it in 3 years, and she brushed the dust off it sometimes, but she never took it down. His chair sat empty at the table, and she never sat in it, and never let it be just a chair. His stock saddle, the good one, the one he'd been so proud of, hung oiled and gleaming in the barn, worth more than anything else she owned, and never once considered as worth anything. Because it was Tom's. She guarded all of it like an altar. And that winter, for the first time, guarding it made her feel something new and unwelcome, because a mended harness sat in her barn now, and a half cup of cold coffee had once sat on her table, and a look she couldn't unsee kept coming back to her at odd hours. And every time it did, she'd glance at Tom's coat on the peg and feel like a woman caught at something. Disloyal, a shamed, almost, for the small warm thing that had started, without permission, to grow in her toward a gruff neighbor who'd never given her cause. She scolded herself for it. She'd made a vow, not just about the land, about being his, and staying his, and not letting any living man take the place of a dead one who'd been good to her. So, she brushed the coat, and kept the chair, and pushed the warmth back down, and told herself she was faithful. Meanwhile, the axe was falling 4 miles south, and she didn't know that either. Harlan Voss called Amos's note early. He wasn't supposed to be able to, not cleanly. But Voss scented the ranch the way he scented all of them, sensed the old man was thinner than he let on, and decided not to wait for spring. He rode out and did his arithmetic in Amos's yard, gentle and ruinous, and told him the 600 was wanted now, or as near now as made no difference. Weeks, not months. And Amos was short. Bad short. Because 3 winters of Della's feed bills sat where his cushion should have been. The money that might have met Voss, or come close, had gone quiet onto Silas's second ledger, sack by sack, keeping a woman warm who thought she was keeping herself. Amos could have told Voss why he was short. He could have told the whole town, and been thought a saint for it, and maybe the valley would have rallied. He told no one. He'd have signed his ranch away before he'd have his generosity spoken of out loud where Della might hear and be shamed. He took Voss's early call standing, gray-faced, silent, and let the man ride off doing sums, and he did not say one word in his own defense. That was Amos all over. He'd carry it alone, he'd go under alone, the same vow she'd made, near enough, made by a man who couldn't say it either. And now it comes to the day that turns everything. February hadn't quite let go. And Della Hartwick had made up her mind. She'd lain awake too many nights over that light account and that mended harness and that look. And her pride had done what her pride always did. It had found the thing it could not stand and set itself to end it. She would not be a woman who owed. She'd carried credit at that store all winter and it sat on her like a stone, and she'd decided she would clear it. Every cent. She would stand clean on her own 2 feet before spring, owing not Silas nor God nor any man, the way she'd sworn on Tom's grave. But she had no money. She'd been through every tin and every corner, and there was no money. Because there was never any money. There was only one thing left worth anything. And she stood in the cold barn a long time looking at it. Tom's saddle. His good stock saddle, gleaming on its rack, oiled these 3 years by her own hand. The last sacred thing of his she had. Worth more than the cow. Near, worth enough if she sold it, to clear that whole winter's account and have a little over. To sell it was to sell a piece of Tom. She knew that. She stood there with her hand on the cold leather, and she felt the wrongness of it in her chest like a stone, but she'd twisted it around in her pride, until selling him felt more faithful than owing the world. If she kept the saddle and stayed in debt, she was leaning on other men. If she sold the saddle and stood clean, she was keeping her vow. That was the arithmetic her pride had done, and it was as ruinous in its own way as anything Harlan Voss ever figured, and she couldn't see it any more than Amos could see his. So she took the saddle down, her jaw set the way it set, and she roped it up behind her, and she saddled the cow horse with the patched old rig, and she pointed herself toward Kettle Creek, with the last of her dead husband slung behind her, and a fierce, hard resolve in her chest to lay coin on Silas Pettigrew's counter and settle 3 winters and owe no one on this earth a single thing. She had no idea what she was riding toward. She thought she was riding toward freedom. She was riding straight at the whole secret, coins in hand, ready to pay a debt that had never once been hers. And somewhere on that same cold road, coming the other way, a gray-faced man on a tired horse was about to see a dead friend's saddle roped behind her, and understand in one sick heartbeat exactly what she meant to do, and know he could not stop her without confessing every hidden thing he'd done. The road ran cold and gray between them, and Della saw the horse before she saw the man. She knew the tired old bay by its walk. Amos Rourke sat it the way he sat everything, square and quiet, his hat pulled low against the wind. She meant to nod and pass. That was their way. 4 words and a tipped hat, and the miles of nothing between neighbors who each guarded their own. But he did not nod. He pulled up. Right there in the middle of the frozen ruts he stopped his horse, and he looked at her, and his eyes went past her face to the thing roped behind her saddle. Tom's saddle, the good stock saddle, gleaming even under that flat winter sky, the tooling on the skirt she'd oiled 100 times. She watched the color leave him. It went out of his face like water out of a cracked jug. Gray to grayer. His jaw worked once and made no sound. Della, he said. Just that. Her name. She had known this man 3 years, and he had never once said her name. It was always ma'am, or nothing at all, a hand at the hat brim and the creak of leather as he rode on. Now he said it low and rough, and there was something inside the words she couldn't put a name to. Something that reached for her. Amos, she said. That's Tom's saddle. It is. Where are you taking it? She lifted her chin. To Pettigrew's. To sell. She watched him take it like a blow to the chest. He didn't flinch outward, but something behind his eyes buckled, and his hands tightened on the reins until the knuckles stood up white and cracked. Don't, he said. The word came out of him before he could stop it, and then he seemed to hear it himself, seemed to know he had no right to it, and his mouth closed hard. It's mine to sell, she said, gentler than she meant. I owe a winter's account at the store, and I mean to clear it clean and owe no man a thing. You of all people ought to understand that. He made a sound, not a word, a sound. You ought to, she said again, and something in his face made her uneasy, so she covered it with her pride. Good day to you, Amos. She touched her heel to the cowhorse and moved on, and she felt his eyes on her back the whole long way down that road, the way you feel a fire behind you, and she did not once turn around to see the man sitting his tired horse in the middle of the frozen ruts, with his heart breaking open, and no words in him to say why. He could have stopped her. He knew that. All he had to do was speak. But to speak was to tell her everything. 3 winters of it. The feed and the flour and the second ledger and the horse he'd sold, and the note Voss held, and the promise a dying man had made him swear by the bed. To save Tom's saddle, he'd have had to lay all of it at her feet, and he could not, because a man who couldn't say her name for 3 years surely couldn't say that. So, he let her go. And it near killed him. Silas Pettigrew's store smelled of coffee and coal oil, and the sweet dust of dry goods, the way it always had. There were men at the stove. There were always men at the stove in February. 8 of them that morning, hunched close over the warmth, spinning the slow talk of a country waiting on spring. Old Deacons, the Pruitt boy's father. Reverend Ives, come in for his mail. Others. Della came through the door with the cold rolling in behind her and Tom's saddle heavy in her arms. She set it on the counter. She was breathing hard from the weight of it and the weight of what it meant, but her face gave away nothing. She laid her hands flat on the leather one last time, the way you'd lay a hand on a coffin. And then she took them away. Silas, she said, I've come to sell this saddle. The storekeeper came out of the back, wiping his hands. He was a soft, round man with a worried mouth, and when he saw the saddle his face did a thing she didn't understand. A kind of flinch, a kind of dread. Now, Della, he said. That's Tom's rig. It is. And it's worth a fair price, and I mean to take that price against my account and have the balance in coin. She reached into her coat and brought out the little cloth poke of what money she had, and she set it beside the saddle. I've carried 3 winters on your credit, Silas, and I've come to pay every cent of it, and I'll not leave here owing you or any living soul. The men at the stove had gone quiet. She felt them looking. She kept her eyes on Silas. And Silas Pettigrew stood there, with his worried mouth working and his hands twisting in the rag, and he could not meet her eye. Della, there's no call for that. There's every call. Tot up my winter's account. All of it. Feed and flour going back. Della, tot it up. And that was when the boy spoke. He was sweeping near the pickle barrel, the storekeeper's boy, 12 years old and slow to read a room, and he'd heard this pass a dozen times and never understood the hush around it. He leaned on his broom and he said, cheerful as a bird, ain't nothing to tot, ma'am. Your account's square. Paid clean through to spring, same as always. Mr. Rourke, he come in and settled it back before Christmas, like he done every boy, said Silas. But it was out. It was out in the room, and it could not be got back. The broom went still. The boy looked from the storekeeper's stricken face to the widow's and understood, too late, that he had said a thing. Nobody at the stove moved. The fire ticked. Somewhere a barrel settled. And Della Hartwick stood at the counter with her dead husband's saddle under her hands and did not, for a moment, breathe at all. Say that again, she said. Very quiet. Silas closed his eyes. Boy, she said, turning to him, and her voice was steady the way a wire is steady just before it snaps. Say it again? The boy swallowed. Mr. Rourke, ma'am, he pays your account. Every winter. Told Mr. Pettigrew not to say. He looked at Silas. I'm sorry. I thought she knowed. The store was so quiet she could hear her own heart. She turned back to Silas. Is it true? He didn't answer. His silence was the answer. Silas Pettigrew, is it true? 3 winters, he said finally. His voice had gone to a whisper. He come to me the first one, the winter Tom passed, and he laid down your feed money and he made me swear. And he come the next, and he come this one. He said you'd not take it if you knew. He said you had too much pride, and he'd not shame you by letting you see it. He made me keep a second book. It's in the back. Your name in it, and his money beside it, 3 winters running. The storekeeper's eyes were wet. I never in my life carried a secret I wanted to tell so bad, and I swore on it twice, and God forgive me, I'm glad the boy said it. Della's hands had come up off the saddle. She held them a little away from her body, as if she didn't know what to do with them now, as if the whole world she'd been standing on had gone soft. She thought of the honey jar on her step each first snow. The Pruitt boy, she'd always thought. A shy child. It wasn't a child. She thought of the store account that had run lighter than her figuring, that she'd blamed on her own bad arithmetic. Her arithmetic had been fine. She thought of a calf pulled from a heifer in a howling storm and half a cup of coffee left cooling on her table by a man who wouldn't stay to be thanked. The mended harness he'd found on the road. The saddle he'd told her not to sell, out on the frozen ruts an hour ago, going gray in the face. Because he'd known that she was riding in to pay a debt that had never once been hers. 3 winters she had lain awake, counting what she owed, and swearing to a dead man that she leaned on no one. 3 winters she had thought she was surviving by the strength of her own 2 hands. And every one of them, she had been loved. She said it out loud. She didn't mean to. It came out of her in the silent store, in a voice she hardly knew. 3 winters I thought I was surviving, she said, and every one of them I was being loved. Then she picked up her little poke of coins, and she left the saddle where it lay, and she walked out of that store into the cold with her back straight and her eyes burning. And 8 men watched her go, and not one of them said a word. She rode to his place with the anger building in her the whole way, because anger was easier to carry than the other thing. By the time she came up his lane, it was a fine white fury. She told herself it was fury. A woman has her pride, and hers had just been laid bare in front of half the county. Charity. She'd been a charity case in her own town for 3 years, and everyone had known it but her. Pitied, the proud widow Hartwick, who thought she was standing on her own feet, and all the while a man had been holding her up like you'd hold up a fence post that couldn't stand. He was in the yard when she rode up. He'd seen her coming. He stood by the barn with his hat in his hands, which she'd never seen, an old man of 58, with the wind in his gray hair, waiting for her the way a man waits for a thing he knows is going to hurt. She got down off the horse. She had the coins in her fist. "You paid my bills," she said. "Della, don't. Don't you say my name like that. You paid my bills. 3 years. You went to Silas, and you paid what I owed, and you made him swear to keep it from me." Her voice shook. She hated that it shook. "Do you know what that makes me? Do you know what I've been walking around this valley as, while you and Silas kept your little book? A beggar. A pitiful, prideful old widow too blind to know she was living on another man's charity." It wasn't charity. He said it low. "What else do you call it?" His mouth opened. And she watched the words come up in him and get stuck, the way they always got stuck, the way they'd been stuck for 3 years. He stood there with his hat crushed in his big cracked hands, and whatever the true thing was, he could not get it out. It was too big, and he was too old, and he had buried it too deep. "I can't say." He got out. I couldn't stand to see you cold. That's all. I couldn't stand it." "You couldn't stand to see me cold," she repeated. "So you shamed me warm." That landed on him like a whip. She saw it land. Here, she opened her fist, and the coins fell. They struck the frozen dirt of his yard and scattered, and she did not watch them fall. "Every cent I can lay hands on. I'll bring the rest. I'll sell the cow. I'll sell whatever I have to. But you will take back every dollar you put down in my name, because I will not be a woman who owed her whole life to a man too much a coward to tell her." The word coward went into him like a blade. And still, he did not defend himself. He did not tell her about the horse he'd sold, or the note that Voss held, or the ranch that was slipping out from under him, or the promise made by a dying man he'd loved. He stood in the cold and let her call him a coward, because to answer was to open the vault, and he'd sooner lose her clean than have her stay out of pity for what it had cost him. "All right," he said quietly. "That's all you've got. All right. I never wanted your thanks, Della. I surely never wanted this. Take the money back if it'll let you sleep. I'd not have you shamed for the world." His voice cracked on the last of it. "I'd have died before I shamed you. I only ever wanted you through the winters." She stood there a moment more, shaking, the tears standing in her eyes and refusing to fall because she'd be damned before she cried in this man's yard. Then she got back on her horse. And she rode away with her dignity around her like a coat 2 sizes too thin, and she left the coins shining in the dirt, and Amos Rourke did not bend to pick them up. He stood and watched her go the way he'd watched her go on the road, the way it seemed he was always watching her go, and he let her. The bad news came to Kettle Creek 2 days later, the way bad news does, carried stove to stove. Harlan Voss had foreclosed on the Rourke place. The note had come due, and the old man couldn't cover it, hadn't the cash nor near it, and Voss, who bought drought-broke homesteads the way other men bought eggs, who called ruin arithmetic and slept fine on it, Voss had called the paper, and Rourke couldn't answer, and so the ranch that Amos had worked for 30 years was going to the speculator's stack of deeds. And now the valley did its own arithmetic. It didn't take them long. 3 winters Rourke had paid the widow Hartwick's feed and flour out of his own poke. Sold a good saddle horse to do it, someone said. Ran himself so thin that when Voss came calling, he had nothing left to answer with. He'd beggared himself, quiet, for a woman, and she'd thrown his coins in his yard and rode off. And now the man was losing his whole life's ground for the sake of her warmth. The story went around, and it changed as it went, the way a thing does when a town starts to feel ashamed of itself. Somewhere in the retelling the word charity fell off it. What was left underneath had another name. Della heard it at her own door from the Pruitt woman, who'd ridden 4 miles to tell her, and she stood in the cold with her hand on Tom's coat where it hung on its peg by the door, 3 years untouched, an altar to a dead man, and she felt the ground move under everything she'd built her pride on. He was losing his ranch. Because of her flour, she went to the barn where Tom's saddle should have been, and wasn't, because she'd left it on Silas's counter, and Silas had sent it back out to her that same night by the boy, unsold, because the storekeeper couldn't bear to buy it. It sat now on its rack, home again. She meant to sell it after all. She'd take the money to Voss, throw it at the note, do for Amos what he'd done for her. That was the arithmetic her pride reached for first, because paying was the only language her pride knew. So she took the saddle down to ready it. And as she turned it in her hands, working the stiff old skirt, her fingers found something folded down inside it. Tucked in behind the fender, worked so far down that 3 years of oiling had never turned it up. A paper, soft with age. She drew it out. She knew the hand before she'd read a word. It was Tom's. She had to sit down on the barn floor to read it. Her legs wouldn't hold her. It was dated the winter he died. The 9th day of the fever, the last day when his hand could barely hold a pencil, the letters staggering. It wasn't written to her. It was written to Amos. Amos, old friend, it said. I'm going, and we both know it. I've got no time for pretty words, so here's the plain of it. I'm leaving her alone in a hard country, and it's going to try to kill her. The winters will. The country will. And she's too proud to lean on a living soul. You know how she is. So I'm asking you. See her through the hard winters. Do it quiet. She'll not take it any other way. You know that too. And Amos, I've seen how you look at her. I've known you 30 years and I've seen it, and I never once held it against you. Because you never once let it show, and that's the finest thing I know about any man. So hear me. If the day ever comes she can love again, don't you dare let your pride rob her of it. Don't let mine either. Give her the winters, and if God's good, give her the rest. Your friend, Tom. Della Hartwick sat on the cold floor of the barn and wept the way she had not wept when she buried him. Not for grief, for everything else. 3 years she'd guarded Tom's coat and Tom's chair and Tom's saddle like relics, feeling disloyal to the dead for the smallest warmth toward a neighbor. And all that time, the dead man himself had been ahead of her. He'd known. He'd known before he died what she was too stubborn to see. He'd not only allowed it, he'd asked it. He'd put a man to watch over her and blessed whatever might grow, and Amos Rourke had taken that dying charge and turned it into 3 winters of silence and honey jars and pulled calves, keeping a promise and hiding a love so deep beneath the promise that he'd let her call him a coward in his own yard rather than let it show. The ghost had let her go. The ghost had been trying to let her go for 3 years, and she'd been holding on to a coat on a peg. She folded the note. She held it to her chest. And the shame she'd been carrying, the charity, the pity, all of it, went out of her, and what came in behind it was so large she could hardly hold it sitting down. Foreclosure day came, and the whole valley came with it. They gathered at Pettigrew's store, because that was where such things were done in Kettle Creek, and because word had gone round quiet as a grass fire that folks ought to be there. The same 8 men from the stove, and their wives, and the Pruitts and the Deakinses and 24 more, filling the store and spilling out the door into the cold. Reverend Ives stood among them with his hat in his hands, and behind the counter Silas Pettigrew, and on the counter, this was the thing they'd come partly to see: 2 ledgers, laid open side by side. Harlan Voss arrived at 10 with his leather case of papers under his arm, and a look on his face like a man come to collect a fair debt from unreasonable people. He was a well-fed man in a good coat, and he set his case on the counter and clicked it open, and began laying out the note in the filing, brisk, as if the room's silence were only weather. The note's called and unanswered, he said to nobody in particular. $600 against the Rourke Ranch, due and unpaid. There's nothing here to discuss. I'll take the signature and the deed and be on my way. Amos Rourke stood at the end of the counter. He'd come to sign. He wore his one good coat and he'd shaved, an old man come to lose his life's ground with what dignity was left him, and he reached for the pen. He'd say nothing. He'd sign it away sooner than stand up in that room and name what he'd spent the money on. His pride was as ruinous as hers, and it had brought him here, and he meant to pay it out to the last. "Wait," said Della. She came through the crowd, and the crowd made way. She had Tom's note in one hand and a fold of money in the other, and Tom's saddle, she'd not sold it. She never would. She'd left home on its rack where it belonged. She set the money on the counter. Not by her own account. By Amos's note. "That's toward what he owes you," she said to Voss. Then old Deakins stepped up and laid down what he had. And the Pruitt man. And the Pruitt woman untied a knot in her handkerchief. And the Reverend Ives, quiet, set down a fold of bills, and one after another the valley came to the counter, and the little heap grew, dollars and coins, egg money and calf money, the small hard cash of hard people, until it lay there in a pile that stopped the room. Voss watched it with his mouth going tight. "This doesn't change the terms. The note was called in spring, read your own filing, Mist. Voss," said a dry voice. It was the county clerk, come out from town, an old man in spectacles with the record book under his arm. He set it on the counter next to the ledgers, and he ran his finger down the page, and he read Voss's own filing back to him, the date of it, the terms of the original note, the 30 days of grace the law required, and Voss had not given. "You called this note near a month early," the clerk said, "by the paper you filed with my own office. The early call's not good, Misty. Voss. It won't stand. This man's inside his rights, and inside his time, and now," he nodded at the heap of money, "inside his money too. There's nothing here for you." The store was very quiet. And Silas Pettigrew turned the 2 ledgers around so the front of the room could see, and he put his finger on the second one, the hidden one, and he said, so the whole valley could hear it, and while we're reading books out loud, "Here's the account I've kept 3 winters. Hartwick, and Rourke's money beside it, every winter since Tom died. That's not charity, folks. A man doesn't beggar himself charitable. Read the dates." He started the very winter he buried his best friend. He looked at Della. "That's the word for it that isn't charity. Nobody in that room would meet Harlan Voss's eye. He stood among a crowd that had closed like water and left him dry, and he gathered his papers back into his case, and he clicked it shut, and he went out through people who stepped aside for him, the way you step aside from something you don't want touching your coat. Kettle Creek looks after its own, Mr. Voss, Silas said to his back. Always has. The door shut. Somewhere down the road they heard his horse. And the ranch held. Not by a gun, and not by a fight, but by an old clerk's spectacles, and a Valley's egg money, and the law-read plane, and Amos Rourke stood at the counter with the pen still in his hand, and no deed to sign, looking at the pile of money that was going to save him. Put there by a woman he'd let call him a coward. He turned to her. He didn't understand it yet. "Why?" he said. Della held up the note. Tom's note. She'd not read it out. Some things aren't for a room. But she put it in Amos's hand, and she watched him unfold it, and she watched him come to the writing, and she watched 30 years of a friendship and 3 years of a secret and a whole life's held breath break loose in the face of an old man in a store. "He asked you," she said softly. "Tom asked you to see me through the winters. And to the rest of it." Her voice went. She found it again. "You've been keeping his word this whole time and you never told me. You'd have lost this ranch and never told me. You let me throw your money in your yard. You let me call you what I called you." She was crying now, and she didn't care who saw. "Amos Rourke, why didn't you just tell me?" He folded the note with hands that shook. He looked at her, this man who could not say her name for 3 years, and the whole store waited, and he tried. "I never wanted you to know," he said. It came out of him rough and broken, and barely above a whisper, but it came. "I only wanted you warm," and Della Hartwick, in front of the 8 men and their wives, and the Reverend Ives, and the county clerk, and Silas Pettigrew with his 2 open ledgers, in front of the whole valley that had watched her hesitate at the December social, and watched her walk out of this store shamed, and watched her come back, reached out, and took his weathered, cracked old hand in both of hers. "Then keep me warm," she said. 4 words. The whole store heard them. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then the Pruitt woman started to cry, and old Deacons blew his nose like a trumpet, and something went round that room that wasn't quite a cheer and was better than one, a kind of long warm exhale, a whole town letting go of a breath it had held for 3 winters. Reverend Ives stood at the edge of it. He'd loved her too, in his kind and easy way, offered her a warm parsonage and a respectable life, and any man might have soured. He didn't. He watched her hold the old rancher's hand, and he saw plain where her heart had sat all along, and his face, when Della finally looked to him, held no grievance in it. Only grace. He set his hat on his head. He closed the hymn book he'd carried in out of habit. "Well," he said, and he smiled, and it cost him something and he paid it gladly. "It'd be my honor to read the banns, if the 2 of you have no objection to a disappointed man doing the reading." And that got the laugh the room needed, and the warmth broke over all of them at last. The first snow came again to Kettle Creek near a year later, soft and early, whitening the country north of the town that Della Hartwick had homesteaded alone, and did not homestead alone anymore. It was Della Rourke now. The house on the ridge was theirs. Tom's coat had come down off its peg at last, folded away gentle into a chest, not thrown out. You don't throw out the dead. You only stop making altars of them. Tom's saddle hung oiled and gleaming in the barn, bought back off Silas's counter by the neighbors and given to her on her wedding day, and it would hang there as long as the barn stood, a good man remembered, and no longer a wound. Tom's note lived in the family Bible, pressed flat between the pages, and on the hard nights they took it out and read it, and were grateful to a man 3 winters gone who'd loved them both enough to see it coming. That first evening of the snow, Della stood at the stove warming her hands, and she heard his boots on the step, and the door opened, and Amos came in out of the cold, and he had the stone crock in his arms. The honey, the wild honey he'd left on her doorstep every first snow for 3 years, in secret, and let her thank a shy child for. He didn't leave it on the step this year. There was no step to leave it on, no secret to keep. He carried it in through the door of the house that was theirs, and he set it on the table, and the table was laid for 2. She looked at the crock. She looked at him. 3 winters, she said. You paid without a word. He hung his hat on the peg. He came and stood beside her at the stove, and after a while, the way an old man does, he put his arm around her, and she let him, and they watched the snow come down over the country they'd both nearly lost and kept. And I'd have paid 30 more, he said. Outside, the snow filled the ruts of the road where they'd passed each other going opposite ways. A gray-faced man and a proud woman with a dead man's saddle between them. It filled the yard where the coins had shone in the dirt. It settled soft over Kettle Creek and the store, and the 2 ledgers closed now into one. Over all of it, the whole hard, beautiful country. White and quiet and warm inside where the 2 of them stood. Some love gets spoken in ledgers long before it's ever spoken in words. Written down small, winter by winter, in a book kept in a back room where nobody was meant to see. And here is the thing worth carrying home tonight. The thing an old rancher and a proud widow learned the hard way, 4 miles south and east of everything they thought they knew. It is never too late to hear it. Not ever. Wherever you're watching from tonight, comment the name of your town below. I'd love to know how far Della and Amos have traveled.